Are you reliable? Have you ever been asked to give a testimony or a character reference? And if you were, did people consider you to be a reliable person? I'm someone who's had the privilege of being a character reference or giving testimony for someone on a number of occasions. And maybe people ask me because I'm a pastor, and I guess even in 2017, people still maybe think that ministers are honest or reliable people. But certainly if you're trying to sell a story, or if you're trying to create an image about something that's positive, you want to have reliable people who people generally see as being trustworthy and their word is believed to be a part of it. And so it's very interesting that in this, the very last chapter of this book of Mark that we have been looking at, the story of the resurrection of Jesus, arguably the most important and the most foolish of all the stories in the gospel, that a man could be dead and could be made alive again. This story is put in the mouths of the most unreliable witnesses that anyone in that time or culture could have imagined. Certainly a foolish move, so it might seem. It says this: when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So the story of the resurrection of Jesus, the very first people who discover that the tomb is empty and who discover that he has risen are three women. Now you might be thinking to me, why does that make them unreliable witnesses? And certainly, at least I hope, in today's world we recognize that men and women are capable of great things and certainly are equal. But in the time when the Bible was written, you have to understand that society was very different. In fact, the society, at least the Jewish society, they had an understanding that if you wanted to establish a matter as fact, then you needed to find 2 or 3 men who could be the witnesses of that, and that if the witnesses were women, then it just didn't count, because you know, who knows what got into their pretty little minds and what they misunderstood. But if we have 3 solid men, then we'd really know what was going on. But yet the people who discover first that Jesus was risen in the Gospel of Mark were women. Now, why am I belaboring this point? Here's what I'm trying to say. If Mark was trying to write a really convincing but untrue document, if his purpose was to convince people of something that he knew wasn't true, that Jesus had risen, let's say, for example, as some have said, that Jesus wouldn't rise, but maybe the disciples stole his body and hid it, or they kind of came up and had a mass delusion and they were just trying to sell this story to other people. If that were true, and if he were going to be writing this propaganda kind of story, he would never have chosen 3 women to be the ones who discovered the body first. He would have chosen maybe a religious leader, a Pharisee, or one of the priests, or someone of respect, maybe Joseph of Arimathea, whose tomb it was. Somebody who people, when they heard the name, would say, wow, that's a reliable witness. Maybe the story is true. But they included these details, knowing that for many people it might be a stumbling block, and they may even be less likely to believe in the resurrection of Jesus because of those who were the first witnesses. The only reason Mark would have done this is because this is actually what happened, and he couldn't get away from the fact that the first people who discovered the resurrection of Jesus were 3 women. It's interesting that one of these women, the first woman mentioned, was Mary Magdalene. And in a previous episode, we talked about how even before Jesus died, she had started the process of pouring out her love for him and anointing him for his burial. Here she comes now early on Sunday morning to complete this process. And they get to the tomb, the stone has been rolled away, the Roman guard are nowhere to be seen, and they enter the tomb, and to their surprise, they find this young man who other gospels use the term angel to describe this figure. And he says, listen, Jesus is not here, he has risen. And then he says to them, go tell the disciples and Peter. So we can say two things. Not only were the first people to discover the resurrection of Jesus women, 3 women, the very first evangelists, the very first apostles, the very first people sent with the good news that Jesus had risen from the dead were 3 women. Let me put it another way. The Peter who preached on the day of Pentecost so powerfully and thousands joined the church, that Peter who was such a powerful witness to the resurrection of Jesus, he learned about the resurrection of Jesus from 3 women. What am I trying to say? Right here at the end of the gospel, Mark is hinting that because Jesus has died and has risen, everything has changed. Nothing will ever be the same again. In fact, the things that seem to be weak are now strong. The things that seem to be foolish are in fact wise, because the kingdom of God has come and it has turned the kingdom of the earth upside down. The poor are the rich, the weak are the strong. Those who are hungering and thirsting for righteousness, those are the ones who will truly be filled. And so the gospel ends on this note of triumph, where those who would be marginalized in the society would be ignored. Those who most people would consider to be foolish are actually the ones who are given the great privilege of taking the message of the risen, resurrected Lord to the world. And so how do we wrap all of this up? What could God do with your life? If you've been waiting to become better, smarter, more reliable, if you've been hoping that someday you'd become, I don't know, more intelligent, more well-read, and you're hoping that at that point when you're more talented, maybe then you'll be somebody who God could use, then you'll be waiting a long time. Because God does not call those who are already ready. He calls the foolish. He calls the unwise. He calls the people who don't think much of themselves and of whom not much is thought, to confound the wise, to confound those who seem to be strong, to confound the systems of this world that for so long have taught and have acted in ways that don't represent who He is. You don't have to have your own authority or your own credibility when you are a witness for Jesus. You simply have to be willing, and the power of the resurrection will be made manifest in your life, and you will be in yourself. The very fact that you are standing there giving witness to Jesus will be itself the evidence that something amazing has happened. Later on in the book of Acts, these same disciples who learned of the resurrection from these women are preaching. And even these disciples, though they were men, most people considered them to be unreliable. They were uneducated Galileans. They spoke with a thick accent, and people would make fun of people like them. But the people around them, hearing them talk, said, wow, these men have been with Jesus. There is something about Jesus. There is something about being with Him that transforms and takes you from where you are to where you ultimately will be. I want to thank you so much for spending time with us over the sessions together. Maybe some of the stories of the gospel have resonated with you, and maybe you're thinking to yourself now, what do I do next? What is the next step? I now see that maybe there is some value in this book that others seem to be foolish. Well, can I challenge you, friend? Don't let the conversation stop here. Why don't you continue the story in your own life? Why don't you read the book of Mark yourself, or any other place in the Bible? Having read, you share in whatever form you can, whether on social media or whether in a conversation or in whatever way. Become one of the fools who takes up a foolish message, just as I have been. May you become, as me, God's own fool, for only the fools can really tell. Only they can believe the unbelievable. Come, be a fool as well.